Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar today. My name is Dr. Pamela Lennon, psychological wellbeing consultant, and I'm delighted to have today with us Dr. Jackie Wilmhurst, who is a psychological health and safety consultant among many areas of expertise with us today, and to talk about a very important topic of psychological health and safety in the world of trust and safety. We have seen both progress and challenges in workplace well-being generally around the world, and we will discuss some of those today, so that those watching hopefully can understand better how best to support content moderators in their work. So Jackie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, Jackie, I always love having conversations with you. You always bring, a refreshing perspective as well. So I'm excited about our conversations today and where we'll end up talking about it as well.
Could be
So
anywhere.
first, yeah. So first of all, how did you become interested in psychological health and safety?
Big question. So back in, I think it was around 2012, I had finished being an academic. I'd done a PhD that was around the psychology of risk, actually, and resilience. But that had been in a different context. I was working around natural hazards, but it was still around how people, individuals and groups and communities understand risk, but also behave and manage risk. But I'd originally had a learning and development background in the workplace. So I left my period of time as an academic at that stage and was back to being a consultant. And I was asked whether I would be happy to take on a role as a freelance training consultant, really, but working with people who go to what we call hostile environments. And that was a combination of journalists, but also humanitarian aid workers. And the reason I was asked to do that, funnily enough, it wasn't about my psychology background. It was because I'm ex-military. And it was at a time when there were not very many women involved in the training, and of course loads of women amongst the customers. So there was a real imbalance of all these ex-military men, and sometimes military, but also emergency services, particularly fire service, sometimes police, but very male-dominated field. And so I was asked whether I would come in and teach more around the security awareness, things like weapons awareness and vehicle checkpoints, and the kinds of things that if you're going into conflict zones you're going to encounter as very real physical risks. Part of that, however, was a session on post-traumatic stress disorder awareness. And it was fairly, it was pretty short. It was a quick sort of like, these are the signs to look out for if you do get PTSD. These are the symptoms, and this is where to get help. Whereas the whole rest of the time that we were spending up to a week on a residential training course was all about risk. It was about identifying hazards, identifying risks, assessing those risks, and finding appropriate control measures. And really where it came at was me scratching my head because of my psychology background and saying, why is it we're spending all this time understanding and managing risk up front and trying to stop these bad things happening and stop people getting injured physically? Why are we not even trying to do that psychologically? And so that was the beginning of my own journey of saying, because I wasn't coming in as a clinical psychologist who's used to treating, I was coming in with my risk lens. It meant I started asking the questions. That's the way I am. I said, I don't want to teach this way. I want to have a go. And straight away, of course, people were saying, but how can we do it properly? How can we do it as a health and safety? And I was like, I don't know, but I intend to find out. And that was 12 years ago. So that was that's the shortest I can manage for how I got into it. But that set me off on a journey whereby I started to do that on those training courses. And the more I did it, the more people were recognizing the value of looking at it that way. And the more I was finding that I was being approached by others.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a similar way that I became interested in psychological health and safety was observing. I worked in many different roles while I was studying to be a psychologist. One of them specifically was quite, occupational health and safety. Was high on their priority, and used to go around every day with checklists to see if there's wires or trip hazards. And there was one little paragraph on stress in the whole enormous, procedure document. And it was just high level, stress is there, sort it out, reduce your stress and off you go. But you could see that it was such an enormous impact and risk to people's physical health, whether that was accidents in the workplace, where it was stress-related illnesses and high absenteeism. So that's where I started focusing my research and my doctorate into the whole area of like, okay, what can be actually done and how can we, prioritize psychological health and safety in the workplace? And that's why I was delighted when the ISO 45003 then came out, which expanded just this little paragraph in stress and made it more, I suppose, feasible for people to be able to use a framework to protect, mental health in the workplace. So
yeah,
interesting as well. And again, coming from different disciplines beyond psychology, but using a psychological perspective, to make sense.
exactly. Yeah, and actually my research, whilst it was risk psychology, was the kind of the field of application, for want of a better way of putting it, like we're looking at risk out in the world. Actually, what I was drawing on was health psychology, social psychology, and environmental in that case, because that was natural environment, but actually environment in the sense of the places in which, physical places in which we find ourselves. And so I love watching how now more and more people are finding their way into this with really valuable, diverse knowledge and skill sets like us, and why we have so much to talk about.
And collaborating cross-discipline as well, which is always really good.
Yeah. And vital.
Yeah. There's often quite confusion around what psychological health and safety is, and I've seen psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's version, being even mentioned in research papers, and just tends to be the two of them get confused. Can you tell me a bit more about the differences, what they actually are, and how they apply to the workplace?
Yes. Yeah. Completely understandable why it would get confused.
Yeah.
At the most basic level, psychological health and safety is health and safety, meaning it's legislated, it's regulated, it is a way of looking and assessing at risks up front and having proper evidence-based control measures for whatever those risks are. So it's a whole piece of health and safety, like manual handling, working from height, hazardous chemicals and substances. It's like it's all part of health and safety. Psychological safety was a term that came out of a piece of research that Harvard University did with Google. And again, to be uncharacteristically brief for myself, it was about effective teams. And it was looking at, teams made up of highly qualified, highly skilled people who'd been hired on the basis of being like the best individual that a company, let's say Google, could find to take on that role, and hiring 5 of those, all with different technical skill sets, and putting them together in a group, a team, and recognizing that when you've got 5 of the best technically experts in their field, they don't necessarily work well together, and therefore the team is not necessarily effective. And for some people coming from psychology, we might kind of go, well, yes. But the great thing is that Google and Harvard sort of decided to start again looking at it, rather than just pick up on what was already known about human relating. And that's, I think there's a real merit in that. Sometimes people say don't reinvent the wheel, but sometimes it's good to take a fresh look. And ultimately what happened is they were looking at all of the things that make a team effective. And there were 5 main things. You can look up the work, there's a TED talk, but they named the number 1 thing, psychological safety. It's cultural, it's relational, it's between people. It's based on the idea that we can bring all of ourselves. It was really targeted around innovation and productivity first, but of course it affects well-being, that you bring yourself, not every single last thing on your mind. We've all got work to do, but that you can be yourself, and that the safety between people in a team environment was the number 1 indicator of effectiveness. It had to be backed up by accountability. It had to be backed up by meaning in the work. There were a number of factors that if they weren't there and you only had psychological safety, then probably no one would get anything done. Everyone would just be chatting. Yeah. But that safety, often people say, is that not the same as trust? And it's very similar, but the real premise is that trust is something that if I'm working with you, I choose to trust you or not trust you. And your behavior will play into that, but the trust is me. I might not trust anyone, and that's me. Safety is created by everyone. It's created in the middle of the relationship. And when you have that safety, it is like a bubble around you in which mistakes can be made, but actually people can bring their best work. So if you look at that, what they meant by psychological safety at the level of team effectiveness, it is cultural and relational, but it's a vital part of looking at psychological health and safety, because one of the biggest risks to our mental health at work is the relationships we're having. And if they're not good and they're not supportive. So they're very different things, but they very much, really, psychological health and safety is the whole approach. And psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson means it, is a component in that. It's one of the things that needs to be there for us to be able to create psychologically healthy and safe workplaces.
Yeah, and then for people who think they can just, right, I'm going to come to work and be psychologically safe, you need the right environment, the right culture in work to be that, to have that contract there and those good relations as well. So, yeah.
And it doesn't mean that we put, when we say people talk about bringing your whole self to work, the reason you have to have accountability very close behind the safety is we know how it can be if people come to work, and we all have horrible things happen in our personal lives at times.
Mm.
And it's absolutely right that we bring them in the sense of being able to say that we're going through something, that we are struggling. This is why we have EAPs, is why we have all these great benefits. The accountability bit is the bit that says, I'm still at work, I signed a contract. If I can't be in work, I have to look at the fact that I may be on sick leave or however long that goes. But the accountability is the bit that says, psychological safety doesn't mean I bring all of me in the sense that I'm not actually getting my work done over time.
Yes, yeah.
It's and that's, I think we'll talk about it a bit more later, but the relationship between employee and employer, there's a very, I wouldn't say fine, but there's a balance to be achieved, a real sweet spot to be achieved. And I'm seeing more and more businesses realizing what that looks like.
Yeah.
And that's really what psych health and safety achieves, is it's like, what's in any individual organization, what does it look like to have that balance right? Yeah. Where everybody's got the right accountabilities for who they are. Perfect.
Yeah. And kind of moving more specifically to trust and safety and content moderation work, before we talk about how we can apply this framework of psychological health and safety, what are the unique, stressors, psychosocial hazards in this type of work that we'd need to maybe look at from a health and safety perspective?
Yeah, so health and safety, certainly UK and Irish legislation is very much almost identical. I appreciate a lot of companies are working globally, and that's why the relationship between the legal and the moral and the good to have and the business case, it's what it is. We can come back to that when we talk about some other things. I raise it here because in the UK and Ireland, the law is very clear in what it says, which is that there is a legal obligation for the employer, and who inside that we come back to, but the employer as an entity has a legal obligation to assess and manage all foreseeable risks in the workplace. And it's any foreseeable risk to the health of your employees. It doesn't say only physical, it just says health. And we know that our psychological health is absolutely as important as our physical health. And I raised that there because sometimes there's a confusion, which again, when we talk about application, it'll become clearer. It's a bit theoretical at the moment, but all of the things that can damage my psychological well-being in my life, at home, my past, all these other things, relationships, all those million things. This is where benefits packages have become better than they've ever been. And there are all those things where an employer can recognize that I am going to have things that will impact on my well-being and will impact on my ability to be healthy at work. And helping me to address those things is a brilliant part of like HR benefits and a good thing to do. That is not psychological health and safety, because an employer can't possibly foresee my relationship breakdown. Yes. Or my child going through a terrible patch, my mother dying, me getting a health diagnosis that I may or may not want to share. Like, my workplace doesn't foresee that. And where a lot of people miss is to go, it is only what's foreseeable. And so to bring it straight back to the content moderation, now there are lots of other foreseeable things at work, but content moderations come into sharp focus, because if there's a need for trust and safety, which is a lot bigger than content moderation, I appreciate, but the need for trust and safety is the trust and safety of the users. The safety of the users includes being able to use these platforms, whatever they are, and there are many, in a way that doesn't harm. If I'm a user, I don't want to be harmed by what I'm looking at. And if there are moderators required to remove stuff that might harm me, then as a human being, there's an acknowledgement that that content, if it got onto the platform and stayed on the platform, could harm me as a user. If there are human beings inside the company needing to look at that, read that, absorb that, work with that, then if it could harm the user, then it could harm the employee, because we're all humans. What's different is that inside a company, there are different being a human who can be harmed by it is one thing, but there are different structures, there are different laws. So with content moderation, one very obvious thing that comes under health and safety law would be to say it's entirely foreseeable in the work that a content moderator does that they're going to have to be exposed to things that have already been agreed to be harmful, or they wouldn't have to be removed off the platform. Now, I know that policy violations are in there. There's a load more, having worked in that field. But we are talking about material that could be visual, it could be image, video, it can be text-based. We are talking about things like graphic violence and hate speech, child abuse, but it can come in a lot of forms and it can affect people in a lot of ways. Now I'm kind of going into the detail, but that's the most obvious part of content moderation. And understandably, social media companies and those who provide content moderation on their behalf have been really concerned to look at that and address that. And I celebrate that. And I've been deeply involved in that myself. What can then be missed is a whole bunch of other factors in the workplace and in the work that are also foreseeable, that can be really impacting on people's psychological health and aren't being addressed. And so we've got to make, that's why the need for psychological health and safety means you start from the very beginning and say, what are all the hazards that are foreseeable? How is it they affect people? Classic risk assessment. And only then can we say that the control measures we're putting in place are actually appropriate. If we don't do that systematically, then we're throwing anything from benefits packages to resilience training, which we'll talk more about, but we're throwing things at people, kind of hoping it'll help. And that has been, I would say, if I'm being very gentle with businesses, that's a very understandable start if you haven't had the right expertise to advise. And we are where we are with it, and what's happened has happened. But I'd say we're at a really critical point now where a quote I quite like is do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better.
Yes, yeah.
I think it was Maya Angelou. But the reason I mention that is to say I fully understand that a lot of businesses genuinely haven't had a clue how to do this, have realized the need, and have gone in with the best will in the world, with the best things they could find. And I think that's all well and good. But now there are people like me telling them, this is how you do better. And so as businesses learn how to do it better, we need to help with how to implement that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've even found working with various companies that each workplace has different problems, different issues, different benefits. And in some cases, their content moderator teams do not work with egregious content. They're not affected by content. They seem to be, working really well. They're more impacted about more, the cognitive work or the cognitive demands or other applications that they need to use, or the monotony of the role, having to read so many different bios and videos where nothing really happens. And if you're, taking some resilience training off the shelf and applying that there, it's not necessarily being smart and cost effective by targeting, okay, maybe we need to invest in better tooling, or maybe we need to bring people together if social connection is a bit of an issue as well. So I think it even makes sense to use a risk assessment to identify, look, what are the challenges in this team or in this workplace specifically? Is it, the impact of content, or is it workplace stressors and high work demands and performance expectations as well? So as you said, it can be more than the impact of content itself, that
very much
and
so.
Relationships as well in work.
Yeah, but still foreseeable in the sense of you don't have to know exactly when a high stress period is coming, or exactly when some bullying may occur. But there are things like a culture where there's discrimination and harassment, and that's foreseeable if the culture is clearly one in which that's happening. There are there's data available for those things. And, deciding that you tackle that by giving people helplines is treating the harm. And so what I do is I keep bringing people back to what health and safety is. And one of the reasons we are where we are, I can see, having worked in big global complex organizations, is that physical health, so health and safety departments in companies are geared to physical health and safety because the people who are in them, who are experts, are highly trained and experienced and qualified to manage what is understood to be health and safety. And it is those things like manual handling, like working from height. Depends, in construction industry, it's a lot more of working from height, but it's area pillars within it that are very well understood, with the right experts to give the right advice on how you control those risks. And then at the higher level, it's understanding how you put in a full system that in which you record your risk assessments, that you support people to do them meaningfully, that you make sure that they are not trained to do this for psychological risks. So quite understandably, many of those professionals have just said, I don't think this is my remit. I think it's over there with mental health and well-being. Isn't that HR? And then HR will find themselves going, well, we don't know how to do health and safety. We don't have access to the systems, the policies, but also, so they fall back on benefits packages because they haven't had the right guidance. And I see why it's happening, but we have to now stop saying it can't be done differently, because I've heard that, and say the reason it's been happening the way it has is understandable. It's fragmented, it's different departments with different expertise. Psychological health and safety is falling down a gap. But there are people like me, people like you saying, we're telling you we know how to help you do this differently. And that's why we really need to appeal to businesses, say, don't mistake benefits packages for health and safety. Because if someone's working at height on a construction site and someone asks them how you're protecting those workers from the risks associated with their jobs, the foreseeable risks associated with their jobs, we're not told they've got a great benefits package, including resilience building, because being physically resilient, of course, is going to make them probably heal quicker if they fall off a building. But no one would say that was health and safety. They'd say, no, you have to stop them falling off the building. If you've given them resilience training as part of the kind of package of how you develop your employees, physical resilience, psychological resilience, that's a wonderful thing to do. We can be all of us have got skills to learn around becoming more resilient as individual people in a messy world. But you can't make someone resilient specifically for that job and say it's health and safety. It doesn't work. I've watched it not work. Demonstrably doesn't work. So we have to stop asking. And equally, if somebody's working from height and they fall off, they don't get told they've got a benefits package that allows them access to a physio. It's not the benefits they go to. When someone's working from height, you say, how have they had all the training that's specifically for working from height? It's not resilience building. It's training for working from height, the awareness of the risks they face, the equipment, the clothing, the harnesses, how to use them, how to watch out for each other, how to always have the right number of people on, and so on. And all of those control measures are matched to a thorough assessment of the risks. And so when you put that across on psychological, I fully understand that at first it's like, how on earth do we do that when it's all going on in here? And it's not as easy or straightforward, but it's doable. I've watched it be doable. And there's more and more evidence coming. And I've heard, for example, one last thing to say on that one of, again, understandable, because it's often coming from a place of overwhelm and fear, is to say, but we haven't got research that specifically says how content affects moderators. And go, you don't need it, because there's loads of research on how material like that affects human beings, and they're human beings. And so even though they're at work and you've got to look at the whole picture, we don't need any more evidence of how that type of thing hurts humans. What we need to do is get on with and
protect them or reduce that exposure as well in whatever way.
Well, that's because risk management is avoid, mitigate, respond. Is when you understand, you do your very best to stop the harm occurring in the first place first.
And looking at the cost of, not having psychological health and safety and not protecting content moderators as much as you can and training them and having them prepared, like some of you had discussed before about differentiating what hazards and risks are, and applying health and safety to the psychological world or to people's mental health can be tricky. So what, for example, would be hazard as opposed to a risk, as opposed to an outcome of poor health and safety?
So the hazard is the thing in the environment that the human's being exposed to, and it's another, again, when people are trying to do this without any training, no one's expecting people who've never been taught this to get it right the first time. But what happens, therefore, is people dive in with the best intentions. And one of the things I see a lot is where the hazard is named as trauma or stress, because it's what the company's worried about. We're worried about trauma. We're worried about stress. So that's the hazard. That's the injury. That's how someone gets hurt. That's the type of hurt. So in the same way in health and safety, with a risk assessment working from height, it's not back injury that's the hazard. It's a fall from height. Or a faulty harness, or it's the thing. And so with content, for example, it's the material that somebody's got coming into their brain. That's the hazard. Or it's the poor relationship they're in, or it's the way they're being treated by their boss, or it's the pressure. There could be pressures. So yes, ultimately there are things that can cause chronic stress, and there are things that can cause trauma, and there's some overlap, but those are different injuries. But we mustn't get hung up on the injury type, because the first thing we're supposed to be doing is stopping the injury happening in the first place. But so much of it's geared towards treating the injury. We've got businesses investing loads in having therapists for stress, therapists for trauma, treatment for trauma, and saying you do need treatment because accidents happen, But if you've done this properly, you're reducing the chance of the harm in the first place by understanding what the hazards are. And you can't meaningfully risk assess without thoroughly identifying the hazards. It's a whole process in itself. And I've seen again where people are diving in with the control measures.
Yeah, it's a mindset shift as well, because you're like, how can I reduce stress? How can I reduce, risk of VT? But that's so interesting to look at, what's causing it in the first place and where to actually focus on to reduce.
Yeah, what's the exposure?
Yeah.
What's actually happening that's going into people's brains. And there's plenty of psychology out there. I try and matchmake because I'm not clinical background. I'm not coming in from a point of treating injury and illness. I'm coming in from a perspective both as a risk psychologist, but also an academic who says there's all this stuff now on internet libraries, but used to be on dusty old shelves. It's like it's not getting used because I like to be a bridge to say there's so much already known that only needs a bit of a tweak to be brought into a new context. But what we do have to do is go right back to basics with what's actually hurting people and how. What is it that they're exposed to? Can we reduce the exposure? And some stuff is done on that, which I do know we're going to talk about. But
yeah, just on that, given all these specific hazards and risks and injuries, how can psychological health and safety be supported with content moderators in their work? How can it be applied from like corporate well-being to an area with these risks?
Yeah, so basically by where it sits, does it sit with HR? Does it sit with health and safety? Is there actually an occupational health and safety that has the right people in it? But it's whether it's inside expertise that's hired in or whether it's external expertise, whatever it is, it's getting the right expertise that says we need to look at the role and the environment, so everything about the work and the workplace, and we need to systematically list all the identifiable and foreseeable hazards. You're not supposed to find ones that you can't foresee. You look at all the foreseeable hazards and you list them as hazards, the things impacting on the person, stress-related factors, trauma, but you don't need to name them as that. When you've done that, you need guidance on how does being exposed to that actually, if I was needing training on working with acid, we have to know how it burns my skin and what type of gloves stop it. We have to know what we're dealing with. So there's plenty of there's a growing amount of expertise available.
Yeah. To
say, if those are your hazards and they're systematically understood and recorded, here now are how we know they impact people and how badly and how likely it's all in the work. Given that, the control measures that first you look, can we avoid exposure any more than we already are? If we can't, how do we mitigate against harm caused by exposure? Because we're not saying no one can do this job, same as people still work from height, but you say you avoid as much of the risk as you can by identifying it up front, looking at ways of working, ways of organizing the work. Those are very organizational things that reduce the exposure. So much I could say about that because I've been inside the company looking about workflows and how people work in the role. Yeah. And then you look at mitigate, some of which comes from the business, but plenty can be equipping and empowering the individual to understand themselves in the role, their unique way of meeting that material and what is it that bothers them more than somebody else. We're all different.
That's true.
And then the respond bit, where most of the resource is, says things still happen. People get hurt. It happens. But if you've done a thorough risk management plan, it's a lot fewer people and it'll happen a lot less severely and less of the time. And of course, you still need the response. It's not an EAP. That is a benefit. It is specialized support for when people have been harmed by the type of thing that is not your everyday stresses and strains of life, which is what EAPs are for. So it's that. And in terms of understanding what benefits there are, and I think we're going to talk about that, but is you look at health and safety, it's like, how do people understand when health and safety is going well? Well, it's an awful lot of measuring what didn't happen, which is not a very exact science, but there has to be quite a lot of looking at the evidence out there that by doing these things you will have averted an awful lot of harm, and how does that translate into business benefits as well as just obviously not hurting people. And there are ways to look at that in structured approaches. It's never fully exact science because it isn't, for a business on a construction company to keep saying how many people didn't die isn't that easy, if you see what I mean. Having effective health and safety, the metrics need careful consideration.
Just on the topic, boosting resilience in the workplace, specifically for content moderators, is a buzzword, and the focus is often on, you know, training general resilience to content moderators, and making sure that they're able to withstand. It's kind of an opposite way of looking at it, as you've discussed. What would you think about that approach?
It's back to what I said before. Even though learning and development, especially around well-being, is not benefits as such, this is all things to help your workforce in life. It'll help at work and it'll help outside of work. It's not work related specifically. So nutrition and sleep and all the brilliant trainings and webinars, building resilience is a good thing. You're going to get a return in your business of more resilient individuals who can bounce back well, who have good skills, who can deal with conflicts and life's ups and downs. They might be more likely to navigate personal problems and stay in work, or actually might be likely to take time off when they need, but come back. You know, resilience is not robust. It's about recovery. So building resilience is a wonderful thing to do in your workforce, and it has its place. It can be part of well-being, part of L&D, part of personal development. It is where it is. I teach it. I love it. What it's not is health and safety for content moderation. It is not a control measure against being exposed to graphic violence, child abuse, etc. It isn't that. It will play into that when you're looking at your whole workforce development, learning and development, well-being. It's all pieces of an overall big picture. But I keep seeing resilience building being slotted in as a control measure for an unidentified risk.
Slotted in, I like that term. You've also done some work, some research on observing what we learn from animals with regard to resilience. What were your key findings there?
Oh, I'm still doing it.
Okay.
I'm right in the middle of it. I am back at university alongside my consultancy practice, and I'm looking at working with wild animals. I run a sanctuary myself. So I work with wild animals who are injured, ill, orphaned, traumatized, and I help them in whatever way I can back to recovery. But they have very powerful ways of recovering with my support, but they have incredible resilience. I actually work particularly with grey squirrels. I have to have a license to do so, and with corvids, but they're very intelligent creatures. And some of the things that I've learned through working with them have brought home lessons to me that maybe theoretically I knew. I'll have read them somewhere or been on a webinar. Like it's not things I didn't know. It's things that hadn't landed in a way with me where they changed my behavior. And working with these animals has done that. And therefore I actually do work around saying, how do we notice some of the ways we've forgotten our animal natures, that we are we're animals. We're very, very advanced in some ways, incredibly advanced in some ways, but we mistake that sometimes for what is very simple and evolutionary in how we're responding to the world, and also very importantly what we mean by resilience and how we recover when we need to.
And what do you think are some of the key learnings from squirrels? What makes them that bit more resilient? What are we denying in ourselves is our animal selves that we could focus more on?
Well, one of the biggest things that I love, and I do, as I said, I have to create the safety in their environment, is that if they're injured or ill and they've got medication they need, and I get them in a warm, dark place on a heat pad in a corner, don't bother them, they're wild animals. There's nothing I can do to stop them resting and recovering in their own, like resting, real, deep rest. And yes, I sometimes have to stick a syringe full of liquid food in their mouths, but they'll drink it. They don't say no. They may be so desperately in need of the rest that they can't even crawl out. So I have to help them. Yes, they have to receive my help. So one is they receive help even as wild animals. It's incredible. Their instinct to survive means they receive help off a great big furless mammal, but they're terrified. So they receive help. But I'd say the other thing is, and I'm deliberately slightly lighthearted in that I don't know what a squirrel saying sorry sounds like, but I'm pretty confident that no squirrel I've ever had has ever said sorry for resting and felt that they were meant to be like squirreling around doing something else. You know, squirrels are beautifully hyperactive when they're well, and they will zoom around all day. But when a squirrel needs to rest, off they go, and I can't get them out from under that blanket until they're good and ready. And when they come out, and I can think they're dying, they're so still, they're so in that deep rest that nothing will stir them till they're ready. And as long as I support them physically and create the conditions for them to continue to feel safe, when they pop out again, they're full steam. It's brilliant to watch. And I
And
just
you
think,
mentioned that importance of safety, of feeling safe, I think, as well, which is important for humans at work as well. I also had a similar experience last week with my own cat, fighting with my neighbour's cat, and it was quite vicious and quite fight and flight. And a few moments later, she hides away under the wall, just kind of, I suppose, recovering from that nervous system activation. And then 10 minutes later, she is curled up in a ball, happy asleep, and doing that important recovery work. So I think animals know how to navigate those physiological responses better and adapt to the environment as it's needed,
and
not
that,
always on like humans are. Oh,
yeah, they're always on. I think we've got to a point where our incredible ability to think and
yeah,
analyze,
yeah.
our cognitive abilities, and they're very advanced, and look at the things we are able to do, but we mistake that and think that we can think our way out of deeply physical things. And one of the things we've done is separate mental health and physical health, and
Yeah.
we are where we are, a whole different professional fields, there's a lot to unpick there, but actually luckily those things are converging, where we're recognizing that yes, we can look at mental health in one way and physical in the other, but in the end, we are one great big joined up system of mental physical. We know how we think affects our guts, and our guts affect our brains, and there's beautiful neuroscience on the vagus nerve. But the reason I mention it here, because it's such a huge topic, is that because we are so busy being cognitive and thinking, we will decide somehow that resting is a nice to have once we've done everything, and it's something to be almost ashamed, if not ashamed of, certainly sorry about, like we're letting someone down somewhere because we're not doing the work that maybe someone else,
or it's the reward at the
or
end,
will be judged for not working fast enough, hard enough. And the bottom line is, we are animals, and if we stay in, you just mentioned about the arousal, if we stay in what's termed fight flight, which it can only be just over the line, but if your system, and we don't even recognize it as arousal anymore because it's become normal. If our bodies and minds stay over that line even a little bit for periods of time, we're not in what's called rest and digest. Not only are we not resting, but our actual whole parasympathetic nervous system, the whole part of our system that digests food, that gets us back into rest and recovery, that brings down the levels of all the hormones shooting around our bodies, it cannot do its work. And so that's why people wonder why not only is there quite profound burnout that's physical as well as psychological, but massive incidents of irritable bowel syndrome and unexplained conditions where doctors are not finding a disease. They're saying your system, and actually not all of it, but a lot of it can be explained by long-term arousal, because our systems just cannot do what they have to do because we're busy thinking that we can think our way out of it.
And similarly with stress and trauma, that arousal, people become bored when they're in this relaxing environment or relaxing state, because they need their nervous systems to change to be able to enjoy and relax and restore as well. Just another.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on around in addiction to some of the internal, rather than taking drugs, there can be addictions to the internal, essentially the drugs that are kicking around your system, and therefore needing the fix and not recognizing it. So some of the less healthy thrill-seeking and risk-taking behaviors, they can all be trauma symptoms. So yes, we need to recognize our systems as being both beautifully complicated, but actually some aspects, the solutions to our problems are really simple, but we're not giving ourselves permission. And that's important, because we're not giving ourselves permission at an individual level often. Back to accountability. If I don't take care of myself as an individual at work and make sure I am not drinking 2 bottles of wine every night because I can't seem to come down, and then a vat of coffee in the morning, I could be being irresponsible with my own individual health, and that's not my employer's responsibility. However, if the culture I'm in and the job requirements and the ways in which my performance is measured are never allowing me to take care of my animal body and self either, that is on the employer. So this relationship has to be one of the right accountabilities in the right place, that I look after myself, as far as if I'm going to sign an employment contract and take home a salary, I have a duty of care towards myself that isn't my employer's responsibility, but the employer has the one that says, what we're not going to do though is make it impossible for you to do that. Not enough time, not the right culture, guilt tripping people for needing to say when they're getting near burnout.
Which there can be embedded in many cultures as well. Just to wrap up, where do you think the future of psychological health and safety is, or any final advice for you know, trust and safety organizations looking to adopt that that perspective in their workplace? Any final?
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I mean, these things take time. I know when I started, all bounty and excited that we could do it this way in around 2012, 13.
Yeah.
Being me, I thought it was all going to be like taken on by the next year or the year after. I ended up going and working in the BBC as their head of mental health for a couple of years and did a load of work around this. And I think at the moment, the fragmentation of what I talked about earlier, the way health and safety is done, HR benefits, everything's really quite fragmented.
Yeah.
And we're not going to unbuild that overnight. But what I'd say is, what I see the future being is keeping going and saying, we do have to unbuild those silos. We can't just go backwards and pretend that we don't need it to be done this way, because we do. It is a legal requirement in many countries, and even where it isn't, it makes no business sense to let your employees be harmed by foreseeable things. Health and safety on the physical side knows this since long ago. So we can only go forward, would be my point, but we need to go forward with enormous amounts of patience. Well, okay, that's me. I do. I always want everything to happen now, but I think that knowing how to do this, I feel, you know, I know how to help set up a strategy. I've done it before, and I know how to operationalize that strategy. But what I keep encountering is those fragmented responsibilities or accountabilities, or the silos of budgets, the way business is, who is it that feels that who's accountable for what, where, who's leading. All of that stuff is getting in the way of progress, and it's not going to change overnight. But what I would say is, if someone's listening to this webinar and does have business accountability, make sure you also have access to a budget that's realistic for health and safety to do this right. Of course, I'm going to say somebody like me really wants to help, but there are more and more people out there who can do so. But I would say just keep taking the next baby step forward, really, because we can't afford to go backwards, and I don't think we're going to anyway. And I see more and more employees, you know, coming and advocating for themselves as well. So I don't know exactly where it's going to go at what pace, but it's going to keep going.
I'd agree. It's been a lot slower over the years than I would have anticipated as well, or foreseen as well. But as you said, just taking those steps as well.
I think the only other bit of the answer to that question is, what I've learned is things can be incrementally very slow, but my experience of other areas of work is there probably is going to be a tipping point whereby not long after everyone wonders how come we weren't always doing this. I do think that's going to happen. I'd like to think that we're quite close to it, but there will be one, and it will then accelerate.
Yeah, absolutely. Jackie, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure chatting to you and seeing your unique perspectives, and I learn loads of new material every day, every time I'm talking to you as well. And just to say thanks so much for joining in this webinar today, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks so much.